All right, everybody, welcome back to the deep dive. You know, we talk a lot on this show about things that we sort of take for granted, things that we assume are, just part of how the world works. And today we're diving into something, well, that you probably interact with every single day.
Yeah, you probably use it multiple times a day.
Exactly. Plastic. I mean, come on, it's everywhere, right? And especially we're going to be talking about recycling. You know, you diligently wash out that yogurt container, you toss it in the blue bin, you feel pretty good about yourself.
Like you've done your part.
Yeah, you've done your part, right? Save the planet.
Yeah.
But what if I told you? Well, what if I told you that the reality of plastic recycling might be a lot more complicated than we've been led to believe?
Definitely a lot more nuanced.
Way more nuanced, for sure. So, to really get into this, we've been looking at a fascinating video transcript from Evrim Alagai. The title translates to, "Do you think plastics are being recycled?"
Kind of makes you think, right?
Right. And honestly, after going through this transcript, I got a lot more questions than answers.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what this show is all about, right? Taking a deep dive, separating fact from fiction,
Yeah.
and figuring out what it all means for us.
Absolutely. We've all seen those recycling symbols, those little chasing arrows with the numbers, but the truth is there's a whole lot more to the story. So let's unpack it.
Let's get into it. So the video kicks off by acknowledging something that I think we can all relate to. Plastics are, well, they're kind of amazing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, gotta give them that.
I mean, they're cheap to make, they're super lightweight, incredibly durable. They're literally everywhere. Think about it, right?
Yeah.
Buildings, cars, that yoga mat you use, the computer I'm talking into right now, even your clothes.
My glasses.
Your glasses, yeah. The list goes on and on. It's hard to imagine our modern lives without plastics, really.
It really is. And the science behind how they're made is pretty ingenious. You see, plastics are essentially these really long chains of molecules called polymers, kind of like imagine a string of pearls all linked together.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And these individual pearls, those are the monomers. Now, the thing is, when these monomers link up, they form these incredibly strong bonds, making plastics super durable. Now, this is different from, say, natural polymers like, our DNA.
Which is also a chain of molecules.
Exactly. But the difference is natural versus synthetic. Like the plastic in that water bottle you're holding, that's a synthetic polymer created by us, which is why it's so strong.
Okay, so that strength, the thing that makes plastic so darn useful, is also kind of the problem, right? Because these super strong bonds, they're really hard to break down.
Precisely. Nature basically has a tough time digesting them. Like, sure, there are some specialized bacteria and fungi that can break down certain types of plastics, but it's a really, really slow process.
So like glacial pace.
Yeah, think hundreds, even thousands of years for a single plastic bottle to decompose. To put that into perspective, that water bottle you finish in a few minutes, that could stick around in the environment for like 450 years.
Wow. That's wild.
To give you a more concrete example, if, say, a scholar back in the year 1021 used a plastic bag to carry their books, that bag could just be starting to break down now.
Okay, so I'm getting a sense of the timeline here.
And it gets even more alarming when you think about things like plastic straws. You use them for, what, maybe 10 minutes? But they can last in the environment for 200 years. That's why we see those images of sea turtles with straws stuck in their noses. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's really sad. And even those little pieces of your toothbrush, those could still be here in the year 2521. It's kind of mind-blowing.
And all of that plastic has to go somewhere, right? It doesn't just vanish.
Right. And that brings us to, well, this massive environmental problem we're facing, right? This accumulation of plastic waste all over the planet. I mean, the video mentions the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is twice the size of Texas.
It's actually even bigger. It's estimated to be more than 3 times the size of Texas. It's huge.
Oh, wow, 3 times. And that's just one of several garbage patches in our oceans, right?
Unfortunately, yes. And it's not just on the surface either. Microplastics have even been found at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, which is the deepest point in the ocean, almost 12 kilometers down.
So we're talking about a truly global issue here.
Exactly. And there's another layer to this global problem that the video brings up, which is, the kind of uncomfortable truth about where a lot of this plastic waste ends up. It points out that a lot of wealthier countries, places like Japan, Germany, the US, France, Italy, they're actually exporting their plastic waste to less developed nations.
So places like Turkey, Vietnam, Malaysia, Laos, India.
Exactly. Countries that may not have the infrastructure to deal with this influx of plastic waste.
So it's like we're basically shifting the problem somewhere else.
It's a complex issue, and it raises questions about global responsibility and environmental justice.
And it's not just about those big visible pieces of plastic either, right?
Yeah.
The video gets into microplastics, which are these tiny, tiny particles that break off from larger pieces of plastic.
Yeah, these things are so small, they're practically invisible to the naked eye.
And because they're so small, they can easily get into the air we breathe, the water we drink, and ultimately they end up, well, inside of us.
And the more we learn about microplastics, the more concerning it becomes. Like, one recent study that the video mentions actually found microplastics in human placentas.
Wait, in placentas?
Yeah, and even more alarming, they found them in newborn babies as well.
That's terrifying.
It is. And you have to wonder, what are the long-term health consequences of having these plastic particles inside of us? We're really just starting to understand the full extent of this problem.
It's pretty scary, and it's not just the physical presence of these microplastics that's a concern. The video also mentions the chemicals that can leach out of plastic.
Oh, absolutely. You see, plastics contain all sorts of additives, things like phthalates, BPA, bisphenol S. And these chemicals can leach out of plastic when it's scratched, heated, or even just stored for a long time.
So even if we're not, like, directly ingesting the plastic itself, we could still be exposed to these harmful chemicals.
Exactly. And some of these chemicals, they're known endocrine disruptors. Take BPA, for example. This is a chemical that can mimic the hormone estrogen in our bodies.
Which is linked to all sorts of health problems.
Right. And while BPA has been phased out of some products like baby bottles, it's still found in a lot of other plastic items.
So this is a really big deal.
It is, and it really makes you question, why are we still using so much plastic? I mean, given all these problems, you have to wonder if it's really worth it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is where the video introduces this concept of the big lie of plastic recycling. So let's unpack that.
The first thing to understand is, well, where plastic comes from. And it all starts with petroleum.
Okay, so we're talking about fossil fuels here.
Exactly. Plastic is essentially a byproduct of the oil and gas industry. You know, the same industry that's responsible for climate change. So the very industry that's causing so much environmental damage is also the one churning out all this plastic that's polluting our planet.
Yep. And to give you an idea of the scale, about 4% of all the petroleum extracted globally goes towards making plastic.
That's a huge amount.
It is. And the adoption of plastic happened really quickly. The video mentions that it all started back in 1869. But World War II really accelerated things. You see, plastic was cheap to produce, super versatile, and it could replace a lot of materials like metal.
So it's seen as this kind of miracle material.
And to meet the demands of the war effort, the American government basically encouraged all these different plastic companies to collaborate.
Which unintentionally created something close to a monopoly.
Right. And after the war, these big plastic companies, they had a new challenge. How do we convince people to buy all this plastic?
So they launched these massive advertising campaigns.
Exactly. They spent millions and millions of dollars to promote plastic as this modern, convenient, and hygienic material. And initially, people were reusing plastic items, right?
Yeah.
Because they were so durable.
Yeah. But that wasn't good for business, was it? They needed people to keep buying more and more plastic.
So the industry shifted its strategy.
And they started promoting single-use plastics. Like, even baby bottles, which had traditionally been made of glass and reused, were now being marketed as disposable.
And this idea of disposability, it really took off.
It did, and it was all about convenience, right? Throw it away and buy a new one. But the environmental consequences, well, they weren't really part of the conversation.
And you have to wonder, at what point did these companies realize the damage that plastic was causing?
Well, the videos suggest that they knew, but the problem is, for a lot of corporations, profit often takes priority over environmental concerns.
So they kept churning out plastic, knowing that it was polluting the planet.
And then came the environmental movements of the 1960s and 70s. Suddenly, people were waking up to the environmental damage that plastic was causing.
There were protests, boycotts, all sorts of public pressure on the plastics industry.
And this is where the big lie really comes in. Faced with this growing public outcry, the plastics industry had to do something. But instead of fundamentally changing how they made plastic, they came up with a cheaper solution: promoting recycling.
So the message became, don't worry, you can recycle it, everything's fine.
Exactly. And it was a brilliant PR move. It shifted the responsibility onto the consumer, like, we're doing our part, it's your job to recycle.
And then they went a step further, right? They lobbied for laws requiring those recycling symbols on plastic products.
Yep. And this is where things get really tricky. You see, those three arrows, most people assume that means the item is recyclable.
Which makes sense, right? It's a symbol for recycling.
But the truth is, it's a lot more complicated than that. You see, the original recycling symbol, the one that was created in the 70s, it was free for anyone to use.
Oh.
So the plastics industry took that symbol, tweaked it slightly, and added those numbers in the middle.
The resin identification codes.
Exactly. And this created the impression that if a plastic product had that symbol, it was definitely recyclable. But those numbers, they don't actually guarantee that something can be recycled.
They just tell you what type of plastic it is.
Yeah.
Like number 1 is PET, which is often used for water bottles. Number 2 is HDPE, like milk jugs. Number 3 is PVC, and so on.
Right. And the thing is, not all plastics are created equal when it comes to recycling. Like some plastics, like number 1 and 2, they're relatively easy to recycle.
But others, like number 3, PVC, that's a lot harder.
Yeah. And some plastics can only be recycled a limited number of times before their quality degrades too much.
Which is very different from materials like glass or aluminum, which can be recycled over and over again.
And here's the kicker. The video actually quotes Willie Thomas, the former president of the Plastics Industry Association, and he straight up admitted that if people believe that recycling works, they're less likely to support things like bans on certain types of plastic.
So they knew that recycling wasn't a perfect solution.
They knew. But it was a way to deflect public pressure and keep selling more plastic.
It's pretty disheartening, and the reality is only a tiny fraction of all the plastic ever produced has actually been recycled.
The video states that it's something like 8.9%. That's it.
Wow. So all those years of diligently sorting our recycling, and only 8.9% is actually being recycled.
It's a pretty sobering statistic. And there are a lot of reasons why the recycling rate is so low. Like contamination is a big problem. If there's food residue or other materials mixed in with the plastic, it can make it really difficult to recycle.
And then there's the issue of sorting all the different types of plastic.
Yeah, it's a complex and expensive process. And ultimately, it often comes down to economics. You see, it's often cheaper for companies to just produce new virgin plastic from petroleum than it is to use recycled plastic.
So there's not a lot of incentive for them to switch to recycled materials.
And the video even mentions that internal documents from the plastics industry have acknowledged that there's not really a market for a lot of the plastic that gets collected for recycling.
So it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. We keep buying plastic, we think we're doing the right thing by recycling it, but a lot of it just ends up in landfills or polluting the environment.
It's a complex issue, and there's no easy solution, but the video does offer some glimmers of hope. Like, it points out that even though the overall recycling rate is low, it's still better than nothing.
Yeah, every little bit helps, right?
Absolutely. And it emphasizes that we need to shift our focus from just recycling to reducing our plastic consumption in the first place.
And that's something that we can all do, right?
Definitely. Like, one of the simplest things is to start using reusable bags instead of those flimsy plastic bags that you get at the grocery store.
And those thicker reusable bags, whether they're plastic or paper, those actually have a pretty high environmental footprint to produce.
Right. So the best option is to invest in some good quality reusable cloth bags that you can use over and over again. And always remember to bring them with you when you go shopping.
And it's not just about bags, right? We can also try to avoid buying products that are packaged in plastic.
Absolutely. Like, choose glass jars over plastic containers whenever possible, and try to buy things in bulk to reduce packaging.
And the video also suggests being wary of those plastics labeled with a 3 or a 6.
Yeah, those are PVC and polystyrene, which are really hard to recycle. And be careful with number 7 plastics too, because they could contain BPA unless it specifically says BPA free.
So it's all about being more conscious of the plastic we're using.
And making informed choices.
And the video makes a really important point, which is that individual actions alone, they're not going to solve this crisis. This is a systemic problem that requires systemic solutions.
Absolutely. We need to hold corporations accountable for the plastic waste they produce, and we need governments to enact stricter regulations on plastic production and disposal.
And the video actually reframes environmental activists, not as like tree huggers, but as warriors who are fighting for our future.
Yeah, it encourages us to support these activists and organizations that are working to protect the environment.
And that includes getting involved in the political process, right?
Definitely. Vote for candidates who prioritize environmental issues and contact your elected officials to let them know that you care about these issues.
And it's also about being critical consumers of information.
Absolutely. The video reminds us to seek out information from reliable sources, from scientists and experts, not just from corporations that have a vested interest in selling us more plastic.
The takeaway here is just because something is convenient doesn't mean it's good for the planet
Or for our health.
or for our future.
It's about understanding the true cost of our choices and taking action to create a more sustainable future.
So after taking this deep dive into the world of plastic recycling, what does it all mean for how you think about that recycling bin now?
It definitely makes you think twice about what you're putting in there.
And it raises some really important questions about responsibility and the power of informed action.
What will you do with this knowledge?
It's something to really think about. And as we continue to explore the complexities of our relationship with plastic, we'll keep you informed along the way.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.